My name is Olga Davidson. I'm from Boston University, and I'm also the loving wife of Gregory Naj. And the title of my paper is Life of Ferdowsi, Myths as Evidence for the Reception of Ferdowsi. And the subtitle is A Multiform Reception of the Shahnameh as Reflected in the Bâysonghori Preface. In previous studies, I have argued that the historicized narrative of the so-called older preface to the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi is strikingly parallel to Ferdowsi's own poeticized narrative concerning the genesis of the Book of Kings. In this present study, I make a parallel argument with regard to the Bâysonghori preface. The text is the preface to the Bâysonghori Shahnameh, a 15th century manuscript commissioned by the Timurid prince Ghiyath ad-Din Bâysonghori, completed in 1430 CE by Maulana Ja'far Bâysonghori, a Tabrizi calligrapher who appears also to have served as a librarian to the prince. Before I proceed with my argumentation, I offer some background based on my previous study. In various manuscripts of Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, the actual poetry is preceded by various prose prefaces, which serve to contextualize, 1, the poet Ferdowsi himself, and 2, the poetry in its historicized setting, which is not to say that such a setting needs to be truly historical. The poet was contextualized through the narration of his life and times, with the focus on this question. How could it happen that this one man, known by his poetic name Ferdowsi, came to compose such a monumental poem about the sum total of Iranian civilization visualized as the Book of Kings? A different version of the life of Ferdowsi can be analyzed as representing a traditional Iranian literary form in its own right. A prose tradition complementing the poetic tradition that culminated in the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi. Moreover, despite their prosaic exterior, these Life of Ferdowsi narratives can be analyzed as poetic agenda. Such poetic agenda are evident in various stylized visualizations. Let us call them tropes, referring to the making of poetry. In the language of these tropes, the artistic process of making poetry is visualized as the cultural event of turning prose into poetry. I argue that such visualization is not just a trope. It is a poetic trope typical of Iranian poetic traditions. There are 4 texts that constitute the primary evidence. There's 1, the so-called older preface, dated in the middle of the 4th century Hijri. 2, the preface of the Florence manuscript of the Shahnameh, dated 614 Hijri. 3, the 3rd or intermediate preface. And finally, the Bâysonghori preface, dated 1829 Hijri. In analyzing the prosaic Life of Ferdowsi traditions as parallel to the poetic traditions of Ferdowsi's Shahnameh itself, I apply diachronic as well as synchronic perspectives. In using these terms, I follow the definitions of Ferdinand de Saussure with reference to language as structure. Saussure notes that the synchronic approach concerns a current state of a structure, while the diachronic approach examines the different phases in the evolution of that given structure. Saussure's definition makes it clear that diachrony is a matter of evolution, a concept directly relevant to my diachronic perspective on the Life of Ferdowsi traditions. Applying such diachronic perspective, I have developed an evolutionary model for studying the poetic stratification of Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. This model is based on both comparative and internal evidence. In terms of such a model, I argued that the evolution of the Shahnameh helps explain the accretive and at the same time organic composition of this poetry. And I extended this argument from the poetry itself to the prose prefaces of that poetry. In the case of the poetry, I argued that the Shahnameh, as an organically growing corpus, accommodates through time the diverse worldviews of its diverse audiences. And I argued that the prose prefaces, the rhetorical purpose of which was to contextualize the Shahnameh and its poet in the here and now, likewise accommodate through time such diversity. When I speak of accommodation as a process that took place through time, I mean that the audience responsiveness of the Shahnameh and of its various prose prefaces cannot be fully explained in terms of any single time. In other words, the Shahnameh and its different prose prefaces respond to different horizons of expectation, and these horizons cannot be seen from an exclusively synchronic perspective. In addition, a diachronic perspective is also required, which is a key to the concept of an evolutionary model. Most previous studies of the prose prefaces to the Shahnameh have been limited to what I would call an archaeological perspective. That is, they have attempted to recover simply the earliest layer of the contents of these prefaces. Whatever does not fit the ancient worldview that is reconstructed from these earliest layers is then dismissed as an interpolation, or even discarded from the edited text. If, however, we open up the inquiry by combining diachronic and synchronic perspectives, we begin to see an ongoing pattern of accommodation and coexistence between older and newer traditions in the evolving poetics of the Shahnameh. For example, some relatively older phases of the poetry of the Shahnameh reflect the era of the Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna, the signs of whose patronage are still embedded in that poetry. Relatively newer phases, however, suggest an era when the poetry was no longer tied to this patronage. Such newer phases could be accommodated through the accretion of themes that dramatize a pattern of opposition, or at least indifference, on the part of Ferdowsi towards the patronage of Mahmud. This way, the poetic legacy of Ferdowsi is legitimated through time from one phase to the next in the history of its overall reception. With this background now in place, I turn to the main argument in my present study, that the prose of the Bâysonghori preface of the Shahnameh, like the prose of the other prefaces and the poetry of the Shahnameh itself, accommodates through time the diverse worldviews of its diverse audiences, and that this kind of accommodation through time has to be analyzed from a diachronic as well as a synchronic perspective. We begin with the recension of the Shahnameh that was commissioned by Shah Bâysonghori. Just as this recension is markedly inclusive in its synthesis of textual variants, so also the actual narrative of the preface of the Bâysonghori recension is inclusive in its synthesis of narratological variants. The narrative of the Bâysonghori preface synthesizes the different versions of the story about the genesis of the Book of Kings as way of explaining the genesis and reception of the Bâysonghori recension itself. As a long-term project, I have been working on a translation of and a commentary on the entire text of this preface. This presentation is part of that project. Here I concentrate on selected portions of the text that highlight one particular phrase of the narrative. As I examine this narrative, I will treat the contents as evidence of a pattern of thinking that reflects on the reception and even the formation of the body of poetry that we recognize as the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi. I start at a given point in time within this narrative. At this point, where the patronage of the Book of Kings tradition passes from the dynasty of the Samanids, who are said to have commissioned the poet Daqiqi to turn the prose of the book into poetry. When the dynasty of the Samanids is cut short, there is a transfer of power to Mahmud of Ghazna. Correlatively, The life of the poet Daqiqi is cut short, and the turning of prose to poetry is interrupted so that Daqiqi only gets as far as 1,000 or 2,000 lines. At the court of Mahmud, other poets attempt to take up where Daqiqi left off. Each of these poets is competing to become the authoritative poet of the Shahnameh. At the beginning of the competition, the most prominent of these competitors is the chief court poet of Ghazna, Untitled. At first it looks as if Untitled will win the competition with the rival poets. At this point in the narrative, however, the unexpected happens. A visitor comes to the court of the Sultan. His name is Khor Firuz, and he hails from Fars in the West Iran. The intervention of this West Iranian figure prefigures the arrival of a new poetic rival, who will make his own bid to become the authoritative continuator of the Book of Kings at the court of Mahmud. That poetic figure is Ferdowsi, who hails from Tus, which of course is in East Iran. As the narrative proceeds, this new arrival at the court of the Sultan of Ghazna will eclipse the chief court poet of Ghazna, Untitled. Like Untitled, Ferdowsi represents the poetic traditions of East Iran. Like Untitled, however, Ferdowsi represents the poetic traditions of West Iran as well. And that is why Ferdowsi wins out over Untitled on the course of the narrative to come. From here on, Ferdowsi will dominate the rest of the narrative. He is the one who will emerge as the single authoritative poet of the Shahnameh, and he earns his poetic name, Poet of Paradise, Ferdowsi, in the process. In the logic of the narrative of the Bâysonghori preface, the competition between Untitled and Ferdowsi as court poets is happening at a time when the Book of Kings has supposedly not yet been turned into poetry. In other words, the narrative supposes that the poetic version of the Book of Kings, the Shahnameh as we know it, has remained suspended at the same point where Daqiqi had left it when he died, and when the patronage of the Samanid dynasty was ended. Supposedly, each of the competing poets in the court of Sultan Mahmud would still have to rely on prose versions written down in books, which are supposed to be the raw material for the poetry that they hope to produce. Such a supposition is most evident in the part of the narrative where the figure of Khor Firuz discovers to his surprise that the court poet Untitled expects to be authorized as the sole poet of the Shahnameh before he has even yet to compose the poetry. I turn here to the pertinent selections of my working translation, and here I quote from my translation. Khor Firuz fired up his brain trying to decipher what kind of a book this could be that enabled its would-be author to receive such lavish treatment before actually embarking on it. How come Untitled, who had not placed the foundations of his work, should be eligible for such adulation? And here I end the quote from my translation. In performative terms, the question can be paraphrased this way. How can you even think of a versified Book of Kings before it has all been versified? As we can see, all that Untitled has accomplished so far in the narrative is to engage in a single poetic performance, which is equated to a scroll, or tumar, of poetry. And this poetic performance is supposedly based on a Book of Kings that had just been sent to the court of the Sultan. The narrative goes on to say that this Book of Kings came from East Iran, specifically from the region of Sistan. Let us read the relevant portion of the narrative, and I quote from my translation. The Imam said, "From the beginning of creation, rulers and kings have all had their own particular sources of fear and delight. Some found their pleasure in putting up banquets and feasts, bazan, some in extirpating danger from matters martial, razan." I end my quote. We see here a reference to the internal poetics of the Shahnameh, where the combined themes of Bâysonghori, feasting, and Razm, fighting, signal the heroic tradition of Rostam and related heroic figures. This tradition, it must be emphasized, is distinctly East Iranian in provenance. By way of referring to the themes of Bâysonghori and Razm, the narratives of the Bâysonghori preface signals its own turn the Eastern Iranian epic traditions about the hero of Rustam and his epic exploits. Here is the relevant portion of the narrative. A certain imam is being questioned by Khor Firuz about the circumstances of the competition among the court poets that is being sponsored by Sultan Mahmud, and the imam explains as follows. Again, I quote from my translation. In the past few days, they've brought a manuscript from Sistan containing material on the life and manner of past kings. And the Sultan has decided that the best of these stories should be turned into verse. That explains why such crowds and multitudes of poets have assembled at the court. Today was the day that the poets were to bring their versified pearls and present them at court. And in the Sultan's discerning mind, Ansari's poem was found to be the most beautiful. He has instructed him to carry out the task. End quote. Here the narrative etiologizes the inclusion of Sistani poetic traditions about the hero Rustam and the Shahnameh. What the figure of Khor Firuz has discovered, to his surprise, is that the poetic Shahnameh is still in the making, and that the content of this poetry is being dictated, as it were, by the book that will be chosen as the source of the poetry, of this poetry. The version that Ansari will use is described here in terms of a textual source. That is, the version that Ansari will use for his poetic Shahnameh is supposedly based on a prosaic book of kings that has been brought to Ghazna from the farthest reaches of East Iran, that is, from Sistan. The narrative of the Bâysonghori preface proceeds to describe the reaction of Khor Firuz. Now that he knows why and how the poetic Shahnameh is being created, and now that he understands that this poetic version will be based on a prosaic book of kings that comes from East Iran, Khor Firuz makes an announcement to the Sultan that there is a rival book of kings that exists in West Iran, specifically in his native region of Fars. He adds that he cannot retrieve the book himself because he, at the moment, is alienated from the people of Fars. So the Sultan takes matters into his own hands. He sends out messengers to Fars to fetch the text of this prosaic book of kings from Fars in West Iran. And the people of Fars now gladly give up this book to the messengers despite their alienation from Khor Firuz. And here again, I quote from my translation. The king immediately ordered a letter and gave it to the messenger to take to his abode, that is, the abode of Khor Firuz, and deliver it to his people, and take the book and bring it back to him. And then the text actually versifies itself. And I will read this little bit, which you just have to imagine in verse. The messenger dashed off like lightning, out on his mission day and night. He skimmed over high and low like a wind in fury, delving into the heart of night like a secret thought. End of the poetry. He reached Khor Firuz's palace and gave the letter to his people. They rewarded him with many gifts and gave the book to him. The messenger brought back the book to the Sultan. Because of this, Khoruz was greatly favored and attained a high rank at the court. End of quotation of my translation. The verses that are quoted here in this context of the narrative, describing the feverish efforts of the messenger to reach the region of Fars as soon as possible, serve to reinforce the point of the story here. That point, I argue, is that there was once a West Iranian Shahnameh in the making, which rivaled an Eastern Iranian Shahnameh in the making, as represented by the Book of Kings that had just been sent to the region of Sistan to the court of the Sultan. In the logic of the narrative, what resulted was a distinct part of the poetic Shahnameh here in the making. Here I begin again to quote, "And the Sultan chose 7 stories from these Annals of Kings, Siyar Muluk, and distributed among 7 poets so that each one could turn a story into verse." End quote from my translation. This point in time is linked in the narrative to a later point in time when 7 rival poets are enumerated. Of these 7, as we are about to see, 3 are court poets of Ghazna, the most prominent of whom is Untitled. I propose here to fast forward to a later point in time, where the narrative highlights the victory of Ferdowsi over the 7 rival poets of the poetic Shahnameh in the making. What we are about to see there is that Ferdowsi becomes the authoritative poet of the Shahnameh in the act of performance. And here I will quote from my translation. In short, he, Ferdowsi, left Herat and reached Ghazna. Some say that Ferdowsi had been unjustly treated by the tax collector Tus, and he went to Ghazna to seek redress. At the same time, Sultan Mahmud had selected 7 stories from the annals of the Persian kings and given them to 7 poets so that each could turn one into verse. Whoever produced the best poetry would be given the whole book to versify. The names of the 7 poets are as follows: Onsuri, Farokhi, Zainabi, Asjadi, Manjik of Timirt, Harmi the lute player, Abu Hanifa of Aska. And Onsuri's share was the story of Sohrab, and the 7 poets who were the stars of the firmament of eloquence were engaged in the Sultan's commission. Meanwhile, Ferdowsi arrived at a garden near Ghazna. He sent someone to town to let some friends know that he had arrived. He made his ablutions and performed his prayers. By coincidence, the poets of Ghazna, Onsuri, Farokhi, and Asjadi, had each left the town of their rivals with a handsome slave boy and were about to have a private party in that garden. When Ferdowsi finished his prayers, he wanted to join them for a while. When he was going towards them, they said, "This dry and somber aesthetic will prove a killjoy to our occasion. We must get rid of him." One of them said, "Let's pretend to him that we are violently drunk, and so that he goes away." Unsuri stopped them. Another said, "Let us each say a half line of verse in a difficult meter and ask him to give us the 4th. If he agrees, perhaps he will be fit company. Otherwise, it'll be a good excuse." When he arrived, they acknowledged him and told him about the condition. He answered, "If I can, I will cite. If not, I will not trouble you any more and leave." Unsuri said, "Fine." Here I end the quote. Here we see that Unsuri has the final word because he was Mahmud's chief court poet, or Malik al-Shura. I continue where we just left off in the narrative, which now proceeds to quote the rival half-lines composed by the rival poets. Here I begin with a quotation. I'll do it in Persian first. Unsuri goft, chun araze toma nabashed roshan. Asjadi goft, manande rohat gol nababad dar golshan. Farokhi goft, mojgand hami gozar konad bar joshan. Ferdowsi goft, مانند سنان گیو در چنگ پاشان. Translation is, Unsuri said, "The moon is not as lucent as your face." Asjadi said, "No flower in the garden matches your face." Farokhi said, "Your eyelashes would penetrate a coat of mail." Ferdowsi said, "Just like Giv's spear when he fought Pashan." They, the 3 other poets, asked about the manner of the battle between Giv and Pashan. He, Ferdowsi, told it in a pleasing way so that his breadth of knowledge became apparent. He joined the party in conversation and companionship, and the poets gave him tests and challenges in poetry, and in improvisation Ferdowsi was extremely dexterous. He wrote, then the text does this in poetry. He rode the horse of improvisation, smashing through the army of thought, clutching the spear of fine words in one wave of improvisation, he broke through the heart of the infantry. And now I end the quote of my translation. The narrative is already making it evident here that Ferdowsi is going to win the contest with the three poets. I conclude by observing that these excerpts from the narrative of the Bâysonghori preface treat the Book of Kings tradition as performed poetry, not written prose. The idea of poetry, as expressed in this narrative, clearly goes above and beyond the idea of the prose narratives. Narratives books, even though the idea of poetic composition and performance is metaphorized in terms of a book culture. A salient example is the passing reference, as noticed earlier, to the tumad of the chief court poet of Ghazna, Onsari. It is important to observe also the fact that the metaphorization of poetic composition and performance in terms of a book culture extends to Western as well as Eastern Iranian poetic traditions. At this point of the etiologizing vignettes about Khor Firuz, the impresario of West Iranian Book of Kings traditions, in terms of the narrative of the Bâysonghori preface, Western as well as Eastern Iranian prose texts are being turned into poetry. Pertinent to these observations is the fact that Khor Firuz, when he is first mentioned in the narrative of the Bâysonghori preface, is pointedly described as a descendant of the Shah Anushirvan. Later on in the narrative, this Shah Anushirvan, whose reign is 531 through 579 CE, is figured as the prototypical recreator of the Shahnameh. He is the culture hero who leaves no stone unturned in finding all regional variants of the supposedly prototypical Book of Kings. And I quote again from my translations. The narrative records and accounts relate that in ancient times the kings of Persia, and particularly of the Sasanians, and among them most notably the just King Anushirvan, loved collecting accounts of the past generations and having them shorn of their anomalies. He habitually sent messengers to research throughout the world and gather stories of rulers of different regions, along with other noteworthy accounts, and to deliver a copy of their research to the royal library. End quote. So the narrative here figures the Shahnameh of Shah Anushirvan as a prototype of the Shahnameh of Sultan Mahmud, which is a Shahnameh still in the making. This description of the genesis of the Shahnameh as commissioned by Mahmud and as composed ultimately by Ferdowsi is thematically parallel to Ferdowsi's own description of the genesis of the Pahlavi Book of Kings, as he claims as his own source. A noble and wise Pahlavan, who is described as a hereditary Dekhan, assembles mobads from all over Iran, each of whom possesses a fragment of a pre-existing Pahlavi book that had disintegrated through neglect. What now happens is an imagined reintegration of the disintegrated text. After all, the mobads are lined up in the correct order. Each of them is called upon to recite his own part of the notional totality that is the book. It is thus that this ancient but once fragmented book is wondrously reassembled by the assembly of mobads. In this description, as I've argued in my previous work, we have what amounts to a myth-made stylization of oral poetry. A parallel argument can be made about the mutually contradictory, historicized narratives that we find in the so-called older preface and in the Bâysonghori preface, including the narrative we have been considering in this presentation. Such narratives are essential for understanding the reception and even the transmission of the Shahnameh. Thank you.